Hey everyone, I'm Chris Carter here on the North Shore Drive podcast, joined today by Adam Bittner. We're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers and what his saying this is the last ride for him mean for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 2025 season and beyond, as he's part of their plan moving forward. We'll talk about that, how Zach Frazier, while Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, Zach Frazier could be the quarterback of the offensive line. We'll also talk about leaders by example and why DK Metcalf could fit that mold very well. All here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive Podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive Podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm Chris Carter. He's Adam Bittner. And as always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, as well as the daily podcasts that come out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in an accident or you need help with workers' compensation, Edgar Snyder Associates has always got your back. Call them today, 1-800-94-EDGAR. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Adam joins us again here today. He was on with us Monday. He's on here Wednesday. And Adam, we actually had news to talk about. That doesn't happen that often in June and July before training camp. But Aaron Rodgers shows up on the Pat McAfee show and says basically he's pretty sure this is it. This is the final year of his career in the NFL, how everything looks. Okay, we know Aaron Rodgers and things that get said can lead to a whole bunch of different directions. Adam, do you believe this is his last year, or is this some sort of ploy that he's just trying to keep people at bay for now? It seemed to me like he was being very truthful, and that's kind of why him and the Steelers agreed to this in the first place.
I don't know. I think if it goes really well, I think if they go into next season with genuine hopes, if he's the quarterback, if they win 11, 12, 13 games, something like that, I have a hard time imagining him just walking away from that. I guess it depends upon what happens in the playoffs ultimately, but listen, this guy's played a long time. He's got a lot of pride. He's got quite an ego. I don't see it happening if it works out. And if it doesn't, I feel like he's like hedging his bet here of like, well, it wasn't my fault. I walked into this situation. It was what it was. I thought it was a good way to wind down. I think what he's doing is managing expectations. And so if it goes poorly, then he can kind of ride off into the sunset and disappear, as he says, which I don't know if I believe that either, but we'll get to that in a second, I'm sure. And if it works out, then I can easily imagine him, starting to talk about, oh, maybe I do want to come back. I love the game. He has all the reasons to come back this year. Why would that change a year from now if it works out?
I see. I like the way you're attacking this because this is very different from what most people are going to see. They're going to take him for Ed's word, but I feel like there's a small window for this to happen. If the Steelers stink, like you say, if they're bad, he's like, "Hey, I did what I could," and he rides up to the sunset. If they somehow win the Super Bowl, he rides off into the sunset and says, "Yep, I'm a champion," just like Peyton Manning and Ray Lewis and Jerome Bettis and all those guys that finished their years on Super Bowl championship seasons. But I don't think it's going to be enough for 10, 11 wins. I think they have to be on the cusp. Like when I mean on the cusp, I don't just mean sneaking into the playoffs and losing the first round. I mean AFC Championship. Like they went in, they beat a team in the first round of the playoffs. They beat a divisional round team, a good divisional round team like the Bills or somebody, and then they just lose to like the Chiefs. And it's just they were really close. And I think then your scenario unlocks where he's like, you know what? This offensive line protected me all year. They've got young and up and coming playmakers. Defense, I can do this another year. I got one more in me, hitting the Vince Carter. But I think that is the sweet spot. But to your point, Aaron Rodgers, he's been a guy who wants to be unpredictable. He wants to come from different directions all the time. He even talked about, hey, he's looking forward to the day that he's not in the public eye as he's on national television saying that. So I do think that there's interesting things that could work into these factors here. But for Aaron Rodgers, I think he wants a sort of storybook type of ending that caps his career, that goes well for him. And maybe the narrative isn't as much as what's important as much as just the love for playing football, like he said on Pat McAfee. But certainly it would be very tempting if he's sitting there at the end of this season saying like, man, this team actually is a Super Bowl contender. what if I gave this another shot?
Yeah, and I don't know. It's he's just so full of crap so many times, and not necessarily in like, ways that cause impacts. It's just I just don't believe a whole lot of what comes out of the guy's mouth. He says, "Yeah, I'm going to disappear. You won't see me." He said later in that interview with McAfee. Listen, you don't go on Joe Rogan like multiple times a year because you want to disappear, right? Like it's not a politics thing. People can have different politics. It's just like
right.
that is the center of the media universe at the moment. So I don't really want to hear that you don't want the attention. You're shocked that everyone wants to know whether you're married or not, but you're flaunting the wedding ring in the picture that they tweeted out saying that you're signing your contract. So that's the prologue to, I just don't believe anything he says until he actually has to make a decision and do things. So yes, I do think it's wholly dependent on how they do things this year and how they either succeed or fail and his role in that.
And see, here's the other factor here, Adam. Is there a situation where the Steelers would say, "Hey, no, Aaron, we said 1 year, buddy, and that's it." And they're the ones being like, "Please retire. We don't need these types of things, hanging over us." Because again, the Steelers want to get their franchise quarterback next season, but let's say their franchise quarterback is a bit younger. Maybe he's 20, 21 years old, still figuring things out, and you want to give him time. Maybe that's the situation where they're like, "Hey, Aaron, come on back for 1 more year. We want to get this guy some NFL experience while riding the pine, learning behind you, so that then he can be our franchise guy."
Yeah, I think that, if you're the Steelers, I think you'd love that scenario. I think that's how you failed to make it work with Ben Roethlisberger. I think you're trying to learn from that situation. Right. Granted, I mean, it's only 1 year of Aaron Rodgers. It's not the same thing as what Ben Roethlisberger means to the franchise, but there's still, 2 of the 12 greatest quarterbacks of all time. And if you can have one of those guys in the room while you bring in the guy you hope is the next guy, I think they'd love to have that situation. I think it slightly depends on who the guy ends up being. If it's a Drew Allar, who's more of a drop back rocket arm type that kind of fits more in what Aaron Rodgers has done well for so many years, then you really want to keep him around. If you end up going, more toward the mobility and that type of thing in a different game than Aaron Rodgers has, maybe you feel less pressure to do that. But I think the door is going to be open to him regardless of who they pick. And I think for good reason, because it worked out for Aaron Rodgers himself, right? He sat behind Brett Favre for quite a period of time, and he was that guy. We talk about it all the time, these guys that sit and then play. A lot of them don't work out, but Aaron Rodgers is kind of the quintessential example of something that did work out. So, it's like kind of a do-over on how you handled the end of Ben's career if Aaron Rodgers wants to come back and if you feel good about him.
And there's still a lot of factors, right? Like, for example, Ben Roethlisberger could not hold on another year in his career. He was you could see him just like basically dragging his body to the finish line there. So like, that's and like if Aaron Rodgers is in that same level where like right now he looks fine, like he's moving around, he's running the bootleg, he's throwing the ball, he still has that same quick release. If that maintains to the end of the season, then I think that's certainly a checked box in the favor of maybe he does try to bring it back again. But if he gets to the end of this season and he's dealing with injuries and he's dealing with that, I think that's what it's like when you're 40, when you're in your 40s and you got hundreds of millions of dollars in your bank account. You're just sitting there like, you know what? I don't need to do this again. There's Teddy Atlas once had a great quote that I love about boxing. They say it's hard to get up and run at 4 a.m. in the morning when you're waking up in silk sheets. And so it's like, it's easy to be that grinder, that dude that's I'm going to set the tone. I'm going to be the hardest working man in the league when you don't got much. And even when you got a little bit, but when you've made it to the mountaintop and you start looking at other things in your life, like him being married and him wanting to do other things and things like that, that's when you're kind of like, is it worth it? Beating myself up for 9 months out of the year to go to do this. I think that's the thing that could broach Aaron Rodgers if he takes a lot of hits. But again, if the Steelers offensive line protects him really well, better than the Jets did last year anyway, the Steelers could be in a position where Aaron Rodgers is fresh at the end of the season A key factor of that, Adam, will be the center position. And I want to talk about the center position next on Zach Frazier, because I wrote about him on Tuesday in the Post-Gazette. And I think there's a lot of good things that can also help with the Aaron Rodgers situation that comes from Zach Frazier. We'll talk about that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Adam Bittner. But first, I want to remind you the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Today, they also do workers' compensation. If you've been hurt on the job, you need to know who decides when you're better, who decides when your treatment's over, and who decides when your benefits are over. The answer might surprise you. It's always the insurance company's doctors. They won't have your back. You know who does have your back? Edgar Snyder Associates. Call them today, 1-800-94-EDGAR, because they'll fight for the workers' compensation rights that you deserve. Again, call Edgar Snyder and Associates today at 1-800-94-EDGAR. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Adam Bittner. Adam, let's flip to Zach Frazier a little bit. I wrote an article on Tuesday in the Post-Gazette about Zach Frazier. And one of the things that Pat Meyer called him, the Steelers offensive line coach, he said he's the quarterback of the offensive line. And naturally, that comes with the center position. But one thing that he saw from him was he saw he was ready to take on the roles of calling out adjustments, making sure everyone else was in the same line. And now in year 2, Zach Frazier is trying to take steps forward. And, I think a lot of Steelers fans felt pretty good about Zach Frazier. And offensive line is one of those weird things to quantify when it comes to how well they're playing and, put a number next to it. So people often reach for grades. But one thing that does happen is that when you could track how many times do they allow pressure to impact the quarterback play by play. And Pro Football Focus charted out of the 21 centers who started and played at least 1,000 snaps last season, Zach Frazier had the second fewest quarterback pressures allowed, only behind first-team All-Pro Chiefs center Creed Humphrey, who, in my opinion, is the best center in football right now and is elite at his position. If Zach Frazier takes a step up from there, I think that bodes more into the camp of Aaron Rodgers could have a much cleaner pocket than he had when he was in New York.
Yeah, I think we so often talk about the offensive line and the pressure and gelling and all of that in terms of the tackles, maybe even specifically Broderick Jones, because I know a lot of people feel good about Troy Fautanu before his injury last year. But to your point, Chris, they actually were giving up the most pressure when Mason Cole was the center a couple of years ago. Mason Cole was getting destroyed in that area. And so the fact that you got that improvement from Frazier in year 1, now maybe in year 2, it is more about the mental part of the game and, calling things out for your guys, helping along a Troy Fautanu and especially I think Broderick Jones and, being a leader in not just a guy who's trying to find his way in the NFL. That's that. And so often these guys make their biggest jump from year 1 to year 2, and he's in that spot right now. So, I think there's lots of reasons to feel bullish about him and what he can do, not just for himself, but to make the guys around him better. We've seen that with some of the great centers the Steelers have had. So I think it's reasonable to expect things from Zach Frazier. It's not as sexy as some of this other stuff we're talking about with Aaron Rodgers and the receivers and the cornerbacks. You kind of have to be a football freak to appreciate what Zach Frazier brings to the table. But he's the one of the few guys you can see in terms of offensive line play that makes an immediate difference statistically. So now it's more about the mental parts of the game.
It is the mental parts of the game. But I think that's where Zach Frazier can help a lot is when you look at how the offensive line needs to be in sync with picking up blitz packages, with understanding how to counter different styles, different fronts, different players. That's where Zach Frazier can, if he can take a step up mentally in his game as well as physically, and how he's helping everyone get on the same page. That's the kind of stuff Marquise Pouncey did at a high level when he was with the Steelers. Was he could be this physically dominant force, but also be a guy that's like, hey, we got this check coming, and that's why they kept that offensive line together for so many years to protect Ben Roethlisberger. Pouncey, DeCastro, Foster, Villanueva. You had Marcus Gilbert for a time. But when you look at that offensive line and what they were able to do together, it was their chemistry, their synergy that kept Ben Roethlisberger clean in some of those big 2010 seasons that allowed for that to happen, and also opened up massive holes for the run game for guys like Le'Veon Bell and D'Angelo Williams to become big-time playmakers for the Steelers. And that's where I think this Steelers offensive line needs to take a step up this year. And Zach Frazier being in the middle is just as important as as Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu at the tackle positions. If those three guys connect, Mason McCormick's important too, and Isaac Seumalo's important as well. But if those three guys connect, the three of the first and second round picks in Omar Khan's first two drafts, that could go a very long way to making this team that much better. And again, I think, one thing that I thought was really interesting when I talked to Pat Meyer was like the confidence in what Zach Frazier built last year, that he can stack something else this year on top of it. Also talking about, hey, he's a leader. He's a quiet leader, but he's a leader. He's not going to be the loudest person in the room, but he is doing so many things. He's studying so much. And Zach Frazier talked about it felt like he was cramming for a big exam last year. This year, instead of week to week having to learn all these adjustments that go with the game, I think that's the important part of this too is, right, Adam, like in college, you learn your system and then you just kind of get ready for the game each week. But in the pros, you learn your system and then you are learning you're learning dozens upon dozens of adjustments, of calls, of switches that you have to be ready for, because each team is throwing something completely different at you in the NFL. And they're bigger, they're faster, they're stronger, they're tougher. All that stuff you have to think so much faster. And now Zach Frazier, where he can grow is that he doesn't have to deal with worrying about getting used to the NFL. He's used to it now. Now he can just be in a position of, hey, let's just be on point week in and week out with what we're trying to do and who we're facing.
Well, what did we talk about on draft night, Chris, in terms of what Caleb Johnson does well? It's the zone runs.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about quarterback of the offensive line, that's where that shows up, right? It's not just coach speak. It's one of the rare things that it does mean something, that you're getting in, you're making calls based on what the defense is lining up across from you and how you're going to attack it with those zone runs. We know they want to do more of that. So I think that's part of it too. We're talking about a lot in terms of the passing game, and I think that's natural with all the excitement around Aaron Rodgers. And I think we believe they're going to pass a little bit more and maybe lean a little bit away from the run than they have in the last couple of years. But if you're a believer in this Caleb Johnson thing and him being maybe the long-term answer at running back, the offensive line and the guys in front of him are part of that and making what he does best work. And so I think that's an important thing to bring up. This still is partially about the running game for this franchise, especially as you move on. Let's say Aaron Rodgers does retire, as we talked about in the last segment. You might have to lean on that running game hard again while you're bringing a new quarterback along. So I guess it's been a little bit under talked about, but I think it's relevant as well.
I do think it's relevant. And I think that there's a need for the Steelers to find their leaders of tomorrow on their roster right now, because Aaron Rodgers also acknowledged he's so happy to be joining a team that has a leadership structure like Cam Hayward, like TJ Watt, like Minkah Fitzpatrick. And he said how he admires those guys, and even just existing next to them and just being like, hey, these guys are really impressive. But there also need to be the kind of leaders that aren't necessarily the flag bearers, the guys that are the generals leading. They need their lieutenants. And I think that's where you could find a new cadre of leaders that develop for the Steelers. And one player in particular that Aaron Rodgers talked about that could be in that category is DK Metcalf, because he's a leader by example. And he said DK Metcalf played a big factor in why he chose to come to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Let's talk about that in the next segment, because I think that leading by example is going to be so important for this team and the players that they develop and they find throughout this next year or so. But we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get to that. But first, I want to remind you this show is also brought to you by UFC Gym Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a way to challenge your body and sharpen your mind, step into something more than just a workout. Welcome to the brand new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy at UFC Gym. Here, it's not just about training. It's about living the values of honor, discipline, and respect. Whether you're a total beginner or leveling up your skills, you'll be guided through a structured program led by third-degree black belt instructor who builds confidence, strength, flexibility, and real technique. Head down to the UFC Gym at the Waterfront or Market Square to learn about the exclusive 3-month introductory package today that's only at UFC Gym Pittsburgh. We're also brought to you by Boss. Boss Menswear has reached icon status for its tailoring, but offers more than just the perfect suit. The collections also feature casual and athleisure pieces presenting a complete wardrobe for fast-paced modern lifestyles. Tailoring and sportswear are brought together in a look that is ready for whatever the day may hold. Boss, check them out today now as they just opened a spot in Ross Park Mall with a selection of menswear pieces. That's Boss. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Adam Bittner. Adam, let's talk about DK Metcalf real quick, and also just about guys who could be some of those lead by example guys, not the loudest person in the room types of players. Now, again, Aaron Rodgers talked about this on the Pat McAfee show. He said DK Metcalf is a lead by example guy. He's a big reason why I'm in Pittsburgh as well. But I think that's the thing with the Steelers. They need guys that are not necessarily the captains and the generals, but they need guys that show the right example for how to be a follower that still leads somehow. Because you think back to those Steelers teams in the 2000s, they had guys like Heath Miller was never the guy that was going to speak up and be the loudest person that said, hey, follow me, everybody. But he did his job extremely well, and he was an example for everyone to follow. And in that way, he was kind of a lieutenant in the Steelers. And I think those are the types of players they need to emerge this season, not just on the offensive line, but at wide receiver, cornerback, linebacker, and a few other positions as well.
Yeah, I think the word that comes to mind that the Steelers need more of, and I think why you want to go from a DK Metcalf or from a George Pickens to a DK Metcalf is just professionalism. Chris, I was just recording the podcast with Jason Mackey that we do on Thursdays. We were talking about Andrew McCutchen and how he is the consummate professional. And is he, the biggest star at this stage of his career? No. Has he ever been the raw, big speech, big locker room interview type of guy? No. But he has this just quiet competence. He knows that this is his job. He's working on his craft. And that's why he's playing the game at 38. And we're talking about whether he should, be coming back to the Pirates at age 39. It's just because he's consistent. He knows what needs to be done to get the most out of himself, even as the most begins to fade from where it was when he was an MVP candidate. And I think that's what you're looking for from DK Metcalf, is just accessing the most out of himself, knowing where that line is, and getting there and demonstrating to other players what it means to do that, and doing the little things right that even if you're not the best player on the team, you're performing to what the expectations are for you, or maybe exceeding them a little bit. And if you have enough guys that are meeting that bar or going a little bit over it, then all these conversations about where the Steelers can go, it all comes together and they become the team that we hype ourselves up every time we're saying, oh yeah, if it all works out, this is where they're going to go. That's how you get there. It's having guys that are able to do that. So I think there's a ton of value there. Is it sometimes a little bit overrated as well? The leadership. I think, to use another Pirates example, we talked about Tommy Pham a lot in the offseason and how he was going to shake up that clubhouse a little bit. And obviously that has not happened, but the Steelers certainly need more of that than they've had. And I think that's what DK Metcalf represents.
I agree with you here. And the one thing I'll say, Tommy Pham, I agree, that didn't work out the way that people were talking about it like it could. But I think when you look at the Pirates, they lack the overall structure, right? Like they haven't been in the playoffs since 2018, 27. Like when it was the last, I don't even know the last time they made the play. I think that was the last time they made the playoffs. They haven't had that leadership structure. So when Andrew McCutchen comes back as old man Kutch, and he's kind of just like the wise old mentor to young superstars. They don't have guys that are like at the TJ Watt level where he is one of the best defensive players in the NFL. Cam Hayward is one of the best defensive players in the NFL. Minka Fitzpatrick is one of those guys. Now, some people might say he'd fallen off, but he's at least still respected like that across the league. And so they have guys that are like at the top there that say, hey, everyone get behind us. We're going to lead the way. And so now when you have a guy who's like a mentor type guy, who's also really productive, that can be a positive thing. Like if Zach Frazier is, because again, it's not just DK Metcalf's veteran, and professionalism, it's also his production and what he'll do there. And I think that's what they're hoping is if DK Metcalf's a guy, like when I asked him directly, like, hey, are you going to be planning to like mentor like Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson? And he straight up said like, well, if they want me to, yes, but those are different types of receivers and they bring their own skill sets that are very unique. So, they're going to grow how they want to grow. And if they want me to help, I'll help. But like, I think that that's a healthy approach for a guy who's like not coming in and say, yeah, I'm the $150 million receiver. Everyone should do what I say. I'm part of something here. I'm part of something that's bigger than me. And I think that's the thing that the Steelers could have on their side is a lot of guys understanding they're part of something bigger than themselves. And if DK Metcalf gets that and Zach Frazier gets that and Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu get that and Joey Porter Jr. gets that, Benton gets that, Patrick Queen gets that, Peyton Wilson gets that, then all of a sudden you have an army of lieutenants behind those generals, whereas I think those generals were sometimes leading guys who weren't as professional, like George Pickens. And now that's easier for accountability to be held because when they're leading by example, they're holding themselves to be accountable. That's part of what that's talking about. And that's the kind of stuff that can create better chemistry, better teamwork, better team environment, and create a better winning, locker room when you look at that situation. I think that's what the Steelers are hoping is they have the overall leadership structure. They have the coaching structure. They've been to the playoffs 4 out of the last 5 years. They just need some of those internal things under the things that have kept them afloat to start to build together now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just George Pickens that was the problem in that receiver room, especially. I mean, look what's happened with Diontae Johnson. Look what happened with Chase Claypool. And DK Metcalf has the authority to come in and, listen, he needs the ball to be happy just like any receiver, but he's doing it from a place of authority that those other guys did not have, of having done it, of having proven themselves, and just an overall impressive package, in terms of your approach to the game and in your ability to execute. He's all of those things that those guys were not. And I think that's important for that receivers room. I think we know that they've been looking for that with these guys that they've gone after who've been winners, at the college level. Calvin Austin was a part of a really great Memphis team, and that was on the Ascent program. He was kind of a program guy for them. Roman Wilson wins a national championship with Michigan, and people have raved about, the piece of the chemistry that he was there. So, it's not just DK Metcalf, it's that group as a whole and being different from what you've had there, going back to Antonio Brown. I mean, we got to say his name as part of this conversation as well. How do you break that paradigm? I think they missed a chance, and I think this was partly a physical thing, Chris, of Juju was becoming that guy. Yeah. And I look at him coming back for that last playoff game to play with Ben, and he was kind of starting to give off that this guy's a Steeler aura, but then the physicality just kind of fell apart. But he was so young when he started with the Steelers. He was starting to figure it out, and you regret that they didn't have that guy being what he could have been for the long run. I think that's what you're trying to find here with DK Metcalf in a different way.
I mean, heck, I think you look at 20 and 21 years old, he had the most receiving yards of players at that age in the history of the NFL because of how well he came into the scene. And you're right, like if he did, I think it was Kareem Jackson who hit him. But it was a knee injury he took, I want to say, in the 2021 season that just completely took everything away from what he was building. And like he was doing a lot of things right that you need to see out of a veteran wide receiver to be a wide receiver one for an organization. And then all of a sudden that injury changed. He couldn't run the routes that he wanted to. He had to get his knee drained a lot. That derailed his progression there. And so you're right. Like the Steelers, they need that adult movement. And I know some people are like, well, he was doing TikTok dances. Okay, yeah, but you know what he was also doing? Blocking every single play, fighting through every single play,
sticking his nose in for those 3 and 4 yard grabs that, on third down, you need to move the chains. It's bringing your average down. When the stats guys like me sit down and say what you did at the end of the year, you're like, well, there's a lot of 3 and 4 yard catches, but they were important, and he was willing to stick his nose in there and do them. And that's the type of attitude that these receivers have just not had around here.
I agree. I think you think about Diontae Johnson, why he's gone. You think of George Pickens, why he's gone. You think of Chase Claypool, why he's gone. Juju Smith-Schuster was not a guy that they were like, yeah, we definitely want to get rid of you because you don't fit here. It was just like, hey, sorry, man, you're too banged up. We wish you the best of luck. But
he's been playing important roles on winning teams. I mean, in the late in the playoffs, and no, he's not going to be a 1,300 yard guy again. But there's still teams that look at what he is and say like, we can still use this guy.
Yeah, head-wise, he's right there, but he's no longer the wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 that the Steelers drafted him to be. And that's like with the Chiefs. He's been important there because he's a good role player because he gets how to be part of a winning environment. And that's the aspect that I do think the Steelers want some of these guys to embrace, and it's going to be very important for this upcoming season that they see more of these guys embrace that. We'll keep all things covered here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette as we continue to see things. We still got a few more weeks until training camp, players report to training camp on July 23rd, but we'll be keeping you up to date with all of that here on the North Shore Drive podcast and our written work here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. From Chris Carter and Adam Bittner, thanks so much for checking out this Wednesday edition of the North Shore Drive podcast. Remember, this show comes on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And there's also daily content that comes out from all of our writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We're back here Friday. We're expecting Dave Damashek to join us here for a Friday episode. That'll be a fun one. Keep it here with the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.